I like it when people get the applause in early, because that way, if you don't enjoy the talk, you don't have to feel bad about not clapping afterwards. So well done. We've had a really good journey this morning in terms of Aaron took us through the Old Testament, New Testament, and how it used the culture of its day. Dave's just done a really good walkthrough in terms of methods of engagement. What I'm going to do is I'm going to narrow this down. I'm going to have a specific look at how you can apply what we've been talking about onto a specific character. So, as Aaron mentioned, I'm doing my thesis on the Superman mythos and its implications for contemporary apologetics. One thing that as a long-term comic book fan, I believed in Superman before I believed in Christ. So my journey was from comics to superheroes to movies, met Jesus when I was 18, and so I reversed engineered the imagery, if that makes sense. So for me, like, I have the perspective that comes from the comic book world and also the theological desire to retain the distinctiveness of Christ in these dialogues. So something that I'm really passionate about is when you compare something with something else, you risk losing the distinctive element of those two objects. So you either pull one closer towards the other. Now, I don't know if anyone keeps up with the internet and around the comments on superhero movies when they come out. There was quite a lot of criticism after Batman versus Superman in terms of fans of the comics coming out going, can people please stop saying that Superman is a Christ figure? You bring nothing to my understanding of Superman by doing that. And for me, that really spoke to me in terms of, if our audience through these conversations are people who aren't intimately involved with Christ, how do we handle the comic book literature faithfully? How do we retain the distinctiveness of Christ? So what we're going to do this morning is we're going to walk through the Superman mythos and look at how we can analyse a character like Superman to faithfully pull out some of the elements that we see in there that are gospel-focused, but also retaining the distinctiveness of Christ, so not weakening that image or weakening the gospel in order to build that bridge between theology and culture. Is that all good as a starting premise? Excellent. So something that Aaron mentioned to start with, and I just want to touch on briefly, myth or mythology in any context is built from symbolic language. Symbolic language is a way that we understand what is happening in our broader world. So one of the quotes that Dave used was around the fact that human beings are storytelling animals. So when pre-literate societies encountered something they didn't understand, they would construct a mythology around it using the language that was common to them at their time. So if you think about sort of late postmodern mythology, it uses the language of superheroes because that is what is common to us in this time. If you go back, say, 30 or 40 years, or particularly sort of around the 60s, Westerns were really popular. Westerns were the language of that time. You go back a little bit before and you had the early science fiction days. And that was the language that was common at the time. So superheroes in this context are the language that is common to our time. And so it's important to realise that as popular culture constructs its mythology, it is drawing out these segments that people find appealing. Something pop culture does very well is it reduces these incredibly complex and dense narratives down to their shortest form. So a character like Superman next year will be his 80th anniversary. Towards the end of June, if you want to mark it in your calendar now. So 80-year history of the character. And what they try to do, or what Snyder has been doing since 2013, is trying to reduce all that down into sort of a 2-hour snapshot where he tries to bring out the full richness of the character, which you can't do. And whenever you sort of hear fans turning around and going, oh, that was terrible, and other people loving it, it's often the 80 years worth of history camp that's turning around and going, you've lost what it was that made the hero great for me. So what we're going to start with is a quick survey of 80 years worth of Superman history. Are we ready? Actually, quick test. Finish this phrase. Faster than a speeding. Able to leap tall buildings at a single. Excellent. Hold that. We're going to come back to it. Okay, so it would be incorrect to say that Superman is the first superhero. So that often gets attached to the character, and it's certainly true in terms of his acceptance into popular culture, but it's not true in terms of the development of the superhero genre. So what you had during the late 1920s and the early 1930s were these characters that were becoming increasingly more than just your average human being. So the Shadow, the Phantom, Slam Bradley, which was a precursor to Superman. Slam Bradley was a Joe Siegel and Shuster creation, so the creators of Superman were really struggling to get Superman out into the world. So Slam Bradley was like a reduced version that was still more human than superhuman. And Slam Bradley still persists to this day. He turns up as a minor character every now and then in the DC universe. And then you had Doc Savage, the Man of Bronze. Doc Savage was a great character. He was raised in a community where he was taught to be the pinnacle of the physical and scientific mind. So much like the way we would see Batman now, he was the pinnacle of what a person could become under their own evolution, guidance and strength. Whoops. There we go. 1938 to 1951. Interestingly, when Superman first came on the scene, he couldn't fly, no X-ray vision, no heat vision, no frost breath, no super speed. He was amazing for his time, but he was underwhelming for what we would consider the modern Superman. And he was very much the champion of the oppressed. So what you have around this time, you're in the pre-World War II or pre-America entering World War II, the Great Depression. American culture is looking at the systematic failure of those systems that are meant to protect it. So the legal system, law enforcement, government was failing to protect its citizens. So what Siegel and Shuster capitalised on was this desire for hope. This sort of cultural need to latch onto something that could provide those remedies. And Superman hit the newsstands at precisely the right time in terms of cultural need meets wish fulfillment. Because suddenly people could distract themselves from what was happening in the world by investing in the comic book narrative. And it exploded. So a year later, Superman had his own dedicated comic book, and it just grew from there. By the time you get to the end of 1950s, you've got the Superman radio serial, which is where the up in the sky, it's a bird, it's a plane comes from. Comes from the radio serial, not the comics, interestingly. A lot of the things that you would, or we would associate as being core elements of Superman's identity actually came much later. The first story of the origin of the planet of Krypton didn't appear till 1948. So the character had already been around for 10 years when people were looking at exploring how do we make sense of his powers, his origin, what's going on for him. 1978 to 1987. This is probably the version of Superman that culturally people still know the best. It's the Christopher Reeve era Superman. Very interesting thing happens at this point. So when you think about Superman through the 1930s, can everyone sort of see the whiteboard? Excellent. So you've got comics and film. During the first 20 or so years of Superman's origin, he was very much your classic myth figure. So he was a Hercules, a Samson, a Gilgamesh, more than he was a Christ figure, or more, he fit more comfortably into that category. And the DC universe, something I pick up in my afternoon session, the DC universe has an elaborate theological structure to it. So the Judeo-Christian God exists in the DC universe. He's called the Presence. And the Presence sits over the metaphysical structure of the DC universe, and then things like the Lords of Chaos and all the other gods fit in sort of underneath that. But the Presence is in there. So in terms of the internal structure of the DC universe, Superman doesn't need to be a Christ figure because it already has its other figures who meet that purpose. What happened, interestingly, when the film came around, is you have this divergence from myth figure to Christ figure emerge. All right. Quick survey of the room in terms of our general pop culture knowledge. Two things happened in 1977, just before the release of Superman in 1978. Two significant movies were released. Star Wars was one of them. What was the other one? No, but good try. Sorry? No. Dun, 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 dun. Oh no, here we go. Dun it. Dun it. Jaws. Retrospectively, Jaws is... There are some people in the room who are now showing their age more than others. The Jaws is often heralded as the first summer blockbuster. So, you know, sort of quite commonly now we have the Boxing Day big hurrah. Jaws was the start of that phenomenon in 1977. Star Wars opened up the possibility of doing these really in-depth, metaphysical, philosophically geared movies that provided a religious or metaphysical theme on a large scale. So when you get to 1978, Superman is coming a year after that groundswell of both the blockbuster and the myth or religion sells vibe when done well in a movie. So you have a really interesting thing. Richard, if you want a bit of homework, the development around Superman the movie is really interesting. Multiple directors were involved. Richard Donner initially rejected the presence of one of the directors, rejected the idea that there was messianic imagery in it after the film was first released. It wasn't until about 10 or 15 years later that he came out and he said, yes, it was in there. So you have this, so the film itself has had this really interesting journey in terms of how we are to understand it. So now we've got a little clip. And listen to the language that's used here when it plays.
We will never leave you, even in the face of our death. The richness of our lives will be yours. All that I have, all that I've done, everything I feel, all this and more I bequeath you, my son. You will carry me inside you all the days of your life. You will make my strength grow, see my life through your eyes, as your life will be seen through mine. The Son comes the Father, and the Father the One. The Son. This is all I can send you. Come on.
got any. Not around here, anyway.
Mother, are you thinking what I think you're thinking?
We could say he's child my cousin in North Dakota. He just now walking.
Oh, Mother.
Jonathan, he's only a baby.
Mother, now you saw how we found him. Martha, Clark, and are you listening to what I'm saying?
Now, I'll admit that hasn't aged well. But did anyone pick up the language in this? You've aged wonderfully, I must say. So did anyone, there was a particular line that was very sort of Christian-y. The son, yeah, the father becomes the son becomes the father, all I have I leave to you, before they both promptly blow up and Kal-El comes to Earth. That level of messianic imagery was dropped into the Superman mythos in 1978, specifically to resonate with audiences. So when you think about Superman as a character, there are two streams. You have the comic book Superman, who is much more the myth figure and has stayed that way. Then you have the cinematic the cinematic Superman, who had that cultural overlay of the messianic imagery to make him more appealing and attractive to audiences. So it was hitting on those themes where people would recognise, okay, so this is an incredibly powerful being. He's got a mission of justice towards humanity. There was that sort of resonance between the gospel imagery and Jesus at a cultural level that wasn't present as part of his native identity. Are people happy with that? Excellent. 2006, Superman Returns. Probably, well, apart from Superman 4, probably the most criticised of the Superman movies. Reason for that is audiences felt that Brandon Roth, who went on to become... Does anyone know who Brandon Roth is now? Yeah. Legends of Tomorrow. Which character? Well done. So Brandon Roth was criticised for staying too close to the 1980s version of Superman. Wasn't resonating with the culture anymore. So you almost have quite a Christopher Reeve-esque movie with Superman Returns. Jump forward 7 years, 2013, we get Zack Snyder's Man of Steel. Very important difference with Man of Steel opposed to any other part of the Superman mythos to date. Superman originally entered the world in the 1930s and was a part of that we need hope, we want hope. The Superman of Man of Steel is discovered within a late postmodern context where people fear religion, fear God, fear what the institutional church, and where there is fear towards these beings who can exercise absolute control over humanity. So the late postmodern Superman has entered into the cultural consciousness in his universe in that time. So even though the tone is quite dark, Snyder was trying to reflect how would people react to Superman now, not how they reacted to him back in the 1930s. And then you have Batman versus Superman, where he was undoubtedly his most depressed. Long-term Superman fan, but even I was like, dude, you need to go see a GP. Like, this isn't healthy, and you know, you can pretty much vaporize the planet, so I want you mentally stable. Which, interestingly, is pretty much a position that Batman takes. Ah, you see, a little bit of humour, a little bit of, see what I did there? So Batman reacts to Superman's presence as a threat. Lex Luthor reacts to Superman's presence, I'm going to talk about this a bit more in a minute, but reacts to him from a more emotional level than sometimes the comics or the critics pick up. Whoops, wrong way. There is no single... Whoa, did I just suddenly get loud? Oh, excellent. I just feel loud all of a sudden. Something that's really important, if you want to do a comparison between, say, Superman and the Gospel of Superman and Christ, there is no single character that is Superman. There is no single narrative identity. You've got the cartoon Superman, you've got the Lois and Clark Superman, you've got the Jim Lee Superman, who is one of the darker versions of the character. There is no individual identity or character that is Superman. He is the empty vessel. The writer or the creator fills in the substance. So Superman is the frame. He's not the person. Does that make sense? So without the voice from the artist or the director or the creator, Superman ceases to function. So whenever you're engaging with the character, you're actually engaging with the people behind the character. Superman is the window used to express what the director or the writer is wanting to bring out of the character's identity. It's not an individual character with a fixed narrative identity. So when people talk about, oh, that's not the authentic Superman, it's like, I'm not quite sure who you think you're talking about, because there is no authentic Superman. Like, after 80 years, continuous publication in the comics, regularly in film since the 1950s, the volume of representations of Superman, to go a little Abrahamic, you've got Sands of the Seashore kind of deal. You can't pick one of those and go, that is the essential Superman. When we're talking to people about Christ, it's important to understand that our perspective of who Jesus is might not match their cultural perception of who Jesus is. So we see Christ as a distinct identity, someone who is significant in our lives, has saved our lives, fills it with meaning and significance. But my Jesus, how I see Jesus, might not be precisely the same as how you see Jesus, and isn't the same as how culture sees Jesus. So when we say Superman is a Christ figure or the Arrow is a Christ figure, who is culture hearing that Christ is in that conversation? Are they hearing the institutional church? Are they hearing their childhood disappointments and injuries? Are they hearing a really positive experience they had at a youth group? Who is it that they are hearing when we, or who is it that they are seeing when we say the word Christ? And this is what I mean about the distinctiveness of Christ matched against what is actually happening with the character. So often we try to bring these figures together without us answering those questions of perspective. Who are we seeing? Who are they seeing? How do we pull those apart so they work really well together? So what happens is you end up with this sort of really messy intermix of imagery that has no clear separation to it. So if you go comparative without sort of the process that Dave was talking about in terms of the identification, or even in terms of just some good basic analysis, you get this really confused picture of, well, who is Superman, who is Christ, why are you making the comparison, what's happening, what's going on. Does that sound reasonable? Excellent. So when we get to, this is the last slide, so this is the bit where we go a bit more practical. So the primary difficulty with the comparative model, as we said at the beginning, it is difficult to say that two things are like each other without sacrificing the individuality of both those objects. If you follow the comparison too far, you end up, as Dave mentioned, in territory where you don't want to go. Any gamers in the room? Thank you for representing. Anyone played the Injustice PC game? Yep. So there is a scene in the Injustice Gods Among Us video game, there's a cutscene where Superman kills Shazam, burns his brain out basically with his heat vision, which is a representation of Superman that is quite well known in popular culture. What makes that scene particularly bad is Shazam is actually the teenager Billy Bastion who says the word Shazam and turns into an adult character. So in this cutscene, Superman has basically just killed a child because the child has disobeyed him. So when we're saying Superman is like Christ, which Superman are we talking about, folks? Because if you don't take time unpacking that, someone who knows Superman through the video game is going to turn around and go, all right, Jesus seems overly harsh to me. And you can't build a picture of grace with that version of Superman and Christ. Like, it's very difficult. So which one of the Superman characters are we talking about? So where you end up is talking about a specific narrative. What is happening in the specific narrative and how does Superman function in that space? How many people have seen Batman vs Superman? Excellent. Quick show of hands from the same group. How many people felt that there was a theological tone to that movie? Yep, great. How many felt that Superman was the primary focus of that theological tone? Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Go back to the 1980s Superman and we all would have had arms up in the air. There's a really interesting scene. Lex Luthor confronts Superman on the roof of the building and he goes into quite a classical theological dilemma. If God can't be all-loving and all-powerful and all good, and for there still to be suffering, but then he personalises it. He says, no one came to save me from Daddy's monstrosities. His anger towards Superman, towards God, towards godlike figures, comes from his childhood suffering at the hands of an abusive father, which he is then overlaying onto Superman as a part of his quest to destroy the Man of Steel. So you could almost remove Superman out of that picture and put in any other character, superpowered character, and the dialogue would still work. So often the Superman or the main character is the distraction from what is actually happening underneath. Back in the 1930s, first issue of Superman, champion of the oppressed, clearly mission on behalf of humanity. Another quick quiz. Does anyone remember what Superman says to Lois Lane just before he goes off to kill Doomsday? No, that's the Titanic, but... No, I don't want that on film. Let's edit that bit. All right. Anyone remember what he says to Lois Lane? You can't do it because you're married to me. You've seen the movie as many times as I have. Excellent. So, all right, so what he says is, this is my world too, talking about the earth. You are my world. His ultimate destruction of Doomsday is out of his love for Lois Lane, not his love for humanity. So earlier in the movie, Superman goes on a journey of isolation, quite biblical, encounters his father on a mountaintop, or the spirit of his father, quite biblical. Father talks about an incident from his own childhood where he had accidentally caused the destruction of a farm. And Superman said, does the nightmares ever stop? Dad answers, when I met your mother. She became my world. So you have in sort of the more postmodern Superman or late postmodern Superman, someone who's, it's interesting, is love a selfish motivation? That's interesting, isn't it? Depend on who's being loved and what is being loved. Superman's ultimate actions, though, are out of love for Lois Lane. So it's a selfish love. He does not want to experience loss, her loss. He actually stops the battle. Beck, my wife, she yells at the TV at this. So Lois Lane has grabbed the spear early in the movie, thrown it into an abandoned building that's got a drowned basement, goes off on her own to retrieve it in the middle of the battle, dives into the water, ceiling collapses, she's drowning. Superman's off fighting Doomsday, and Lois Lane is tapping for him to help. He stops the battle to go rescue her. And it's like, okay, you probably weren't the best person, Lois, to dive into the water of an unknown depth to rescue a spear while the building is collapsing. Got to question your judgment there. But Superman stops what he's doing to rescue Lois. So you have this really interesting thing where increasingly the Superman mythos is turning towards someone who would act a lot more like we would act, and not what we would expect a saviour to act like. So progressively, that comparative model is breaking down, but the analytical process has unlimited capacity for dialogue. Let's talk about love. Let's talk about Jesus' willingness to sacrifice everything for humanity. Let's talk about unselfish love. Let's talk about healing in the face of abuse and trauma. And let's look at how much the world fears the church and what the church has done historically. The whole premise of the movie is essentially we don't want to be ruled by someone who can make us do whatever they want us to do, which is Christianity without relationship. When you think about it, the fear that Jesus will make me do things I don't want to do. I became a Christian when I was 18. One of the interesting things that I found during that first year is the church I was a part of was going through a real missional drive, trying to get people out as missionaries. And they would often get up the front on a Sunday morning and say, God might make you do that thing that you don't want to do. He might put you in a place of discomfort. He might push you beyond your comfort zone. He might make you do things that you don't want to do. How many people think that's true? How many think it's his prerogative as Lord of your life to make that call? How many people don't want him to make that call? How many people never ask the question in case he does? So even sort of in our own walk with Jesus, we struggle with that authority obedience thing in terms of our practical day-to-day walk. And then when we try to engage with culture, with people in the landscape who have, to be honest, they have some good reasons to be suspicious of the church and Christians. And then we try to introduce Jesus as the Lord of our lives and Lords of their lives. It is a confronting conversation. And popular culture is clearly telling us that it's a conversation that people are really concerned about having. Earlier in the film, there's a montage of news clips. And you get these snippets of these interviews. And one of them, the interviewer says, the world has always looked for a messianic figure. Is Superman one of these figures, or are we just projecting onto him what we want him to be? And so just in terms of wrapping up, how am I doing for time? 5? Excellent. 4. Yep. Wow, that went down like 5 and then 4. Like I think that finger's broken. I don't think that's keeping good time. So we're entering into this space where as Christians, what are we projecting onto Superman or to Arrow or to Batman or Green Lantern? Are we projecting Jesus onto them to make it easier to have the conversation with popular culture? Are we projecting our hopes in the wrong space? And for me, that is the question that I always ask myself when I'm trying to pull out these components. Is this me bringing my sense of Christ to the character? Is this me seeing those elements in the film? And if I want to communicate this to someone outside the church, how do I do it in a way that faithfully takes care of Superman and retains the distinctiveness of Christ? And I just want to leave you with that as our last thought. Thank you.